The Iran war is now in its 13th consecutive night of U.S. airstrikes. The New York Times reported yesterday that Iran rejected a ceasefire proposal that Trump conveyed through Iraq's prime minister. Within hours, a U.S. official called that report not accurate. Iran's state media called it diversionary and misleading. The Iraqi prime minister's office called it unfounded. Trump says talks continue, and Tehran is getting more serious. Saudi Arabia struck Houthi targets in Yemen after the Houthis attacked another Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. The head of the International Energy Agency warned that a full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is now essential to avoid further deterioration in global energy security. Separately, the DRC Ebola outbreak has now killed at least 967 people, infected 2,423 confirmed cases, spread across 5 provinces, and driven healthcare workers to strike over unpaid wages at the same hospitals treating patients. And the FIFA accountability story that defined this World Cup is settling into a shape where one investigation is active, the bigger questions are not. And the institutional legacy of the tournament is being written quietly. Let's take all 3. Start with Iran, because the ceasefire dispute that erupted in media yesterday is itself the most revealing story of the week. Not for what any individual report says, but for what the entire episode demonstrates about how both governments are managing the diplomatic dimension of an active shooting war. Here is what happened. The New York Times published a report stating that Iran had rejected a ceasefire proposal that President Trump conveyed via Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi, who recently met with Trump in Washington. The NYT's reporting indicated Iran was not interested in a temporary deal that did not resolve outstanding questions around control of the Strait of Hormuz. CNN confirmed the report had been published within the same news cycle. Multiple parties immediately denied significant elements of the story. A U.S. official told CNN the NYT account was not accurate. Iranian state media also characterized the report as diversionary and misleading. The Iraqi Prime Minister's own office disputed the account as unfounded. U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, amplified Iraq's denial on social media, posting that Iraq is getting the record straight. Trump, asked about the diplomatic situation, said the U.S. and Iran remain in talks, and that he believes Tehran is getting more serious. Let me describe what this sequence of events actually demonstrates plainly. A major American newspaper reported a specific diplomatic development. Iran rejected a ceasefire proposal. The government whose proposal was reportedly rejected said the report wasn't accurate. The country that was supposedly the conduit for the proposal said it never happened. The country that was supposedly doing the rejecting called it diversionary. And the president whose proposal was allegedly rejected said talks continue, and the other side is getting more serious. All of these things happened in the span of approximately 24 hours. There are a limited number of explanations for why all of these parties are saying different things about the same diplomatic exchange. 1. The NYT sources were wrong or misunderstood what happened. One or more parties are deliberately shaping the public account to serve their interests. 3. There genuinely isn't a single coherent account because the communication between Washington and Tehran runs through so many different intermediaries, Pakistan, Qatar, Oman, Iraq, that what starts as one version of a proposal becomes something different by the time it's characterized and then recharacterized. All 3 of these explanations are consistent with what was publicly confirmed. None of them requires fabricating anything. What is simply confirmed without dispute is this. The United States has conducted airstrikes on Iran for 13 consecutive nights. Iran has been striking U.S. military assets in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Qatar in retaliation throughout the same period. The Strait of Hormuz remains significantly disrupted. Oil is at or near $100 a barrel. IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol said this week that a full and unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz will be essential to avoid a further deterioration in global energy security. Technically grounded statement that the current disruption is already deteriorating global energy security, and that without a full reopening, the deterioration will continue. That statement stands independently of whatever did or didn't happen between Trump, al-Zaidi, and Tehran. Saudi Arabia's decision to launch its own strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen, following another Saudi vessel being attacked in the Red Sea, adds a further escalatory layer to an already complex regional picture. The Houthis declared a naval blockade on Saudi Arabia on July 21st. Saudi Arabia has now responded militarily. This is the Houthi conflict, which had been largely separate from the US-Iran war, becoming operationally entangled with it, creating a situation where strikes and counterstrikes are now happening across the entire Gulf Red Sea corridor simultaneously. UN Secretary-General Guterres called this week for immediate de-escalation and urged the Houthis to stop attacking. These are the words of the UN directed at multiple parties, because multiple parties are conducting operations. This is not a contained conflict with two sides. It is a cascading regional military engagement with at least 4 distinct but connected fronts: the Strait of Hormuz, Gulf US bases, the Red Sea, and Houthi Saudi Arabia. Now the DRC, because a disease that has killed nearly 1,000 people in 2 months, deserves more coverage than it is getting. As of July 19, the Democratic Republic of Congo's Ebola outbreak, caused by the Bundibugyo species of the Ebola virus, which is one for which no licensed vaccine currently exists, had produced 2,423 confirmed cases and 967 deaths. The UN's own audio briefing from July 21st reported both numbers and quoted the WHO's Dr. Tierno Balde directly. This outbreak remains ahead of us, and we are still in the phase of catching up. 5 provinces are now affected. The province of Ituri in eastern DRC is the epicenter, accounting for more than 90% of cases and 80% of deaths. The other affected provinces are North Kivu, South Kivu, Haut-Uele, and Chopo, all in eastern DRC, where decades of armed conflict have hollowed out health infrastructure and forced millions of people into displacement conditions that make disease containment structurally harder. The specific details of what's happening on the ground go significantly beyond a mortality count. As of June 19th, WHO and World Food Program staff reported that patients had been fleeing treatment facilities in search of food, not because they were asymptomatic, not because they distrusted the medical protocols, but because there was not enough food at the facilities treating them. More than 150 patients had escaped from facilities since late May for various reasons, including the basic inability of those facilities to meet the nutritional needs of people already weakened by a hemorrhagic fever. Healthcare workers at Bunia General Hospital and Rwampara General Hospital had gone on strike over unpaid wages and difficult working conditions. These are the hospitals treating Ebola patients. Their staff is not being paid. The international spread is already happening. A U.S. citizen working for a humanitarian organization in DRC tested positive for Bundibugyo virus on July 10th, confirmed by the CDC. A French national imported a case to France on June 24th. Uganda confirmed 20 cases and 2 deaths before declaring the end of its outbreak under control on July 16th, when its last patient was discharged. Cases from DRC reached the capital, Kampala, before Uganda's outbreak was contained. The geographical logic of the outbreak, spreading from Ituri to North Kivu, South Kivu, and eventually to capital cities, is the same logic that made the 2014 to 2016 West African Ebola outbreak grow to 28,000 cases before international response scaled to meet it. The United States imposed 21-day travel restrictions on Americans returning from DRC in mid-July, the correct technical response given Bundibugyo's maximum incubation period. What it does not do is address the structural conditions producing the outbreak: the healthcare workers not being paid, the treatment facilities with no food, the insecurity in Ituri that WHO specifically cited as making response operations difficult, the militia control of some affected territory. A travel restriction tells American citizens where they cannot go. It does not rebuild the health infrastructure of a country whose eastern provinces have been in continuous armed conflict for decades, whose healthcare workers are on strike, and whose patients are fleeing treatment centers to find food. The U.S. Agency for International Development, which would historically be the primary U.S. instrument for addressing the structural conditions underneath an outbreak like this, has faced significant budget and staffing reductions under the current administration. WHO's emergency funding is itself under pressure. The global health architecture that exists to catch outbreaks before they become epidemics is being tested in exactly the circumstances: resource constraints, conflict zones, inadequate healthcare infrastructure that have produced every major Ebola epidemic in the past 30 years. We are still in the phase of catching up, the WHO doctor said on July 21st. The outbreak is currently ahead of the response. That is the accurate description of where things stand. And now the FIFA story, because the trajectory of this particular accountability process is becoming clearer and worth naming directly. FIFA is currently investigating Argentina's post-World Cup final conduct, specifically the altercation with Spanish players that occurred after Spain's 1-0 extra-time victory on July 19th. Leandro Paredes spoke about what happened. The investigation is active and proceeding through FIFA's normal disciplinary channels. What is not being investigated, by any body with formal authority to investigate it, are the three developments I documented in detail over the past 2 weeks. The Trump-Infantino phone call that led to the first reversal of a tournament red card suspension since 1962. Egypt's official FIFA complaint about the VAR decision that disallowed their second goal against Argentina while declining to review an apparent Salah penalty. And Infantino's documented entry into Argentina's locker room after a group stage match, alongside his statement to Argentine media that he had suffered with them during the Egypt match. These three items have been publicly reported, denied selectively, and not subjected to any formal institutional inquiry. They are not part of the current FIFA investigation. The FIFA investigation that is active concerns something that happened in a corridor after the final whistle. The FIFA questions that are not being investigated concern decisions made by an institution's leadership during the tournament itself. Both sets of questions belong to the same tournament's institutional record. The investigation that is happening is the smaller of the two. I want to be precise about what this settlement of the narrative means. Spain won the World Cup. That result is legitimate and confirmed. Their XG in the final was 1.94 against Argentina's 0.2. Their dominance across 7 matches was the tournament's most consistent statistical story. And there is no serious argument that Spain did not deserve the championship. The tournament's sports record is clean. Its institutional record is not. And the current post-final disciplinary process does not engage with the parts that aren't clean. FIFA's post-match investigation into Argentina's locker room conduct is, in its own right, appropriate institutional process. A post-final altercation between teams is worth documenting and sanctioning if warranted. The issue is not that FIFA is investigating it. The issue is that FIFA has not announced any inquiry into the processes that produced Argentina's path to the final, processes that generated an official complaint from Egypt's National Federation, generated an EU Parliament member calling the organization profoundly corrupt, and generated a presidential phone call that created a 64-year precedent. Investigating what happened in the corridor while not investigating what happened before it is a selective institutional response. Like the tournament's results themselves, is now part of the World Cup 2026 permanent record. 3 stories today. The Iran war's 13th consecutive night is happening alongside a diplomatic fog in which a major newspaper, a U.S. official, Iran's state media, and Iraq's prime minister all simultaneously contradicted each other about what did or didn't happen between Washington and Tehran. While Trump said, talks continue, Saudi Arabia hit Yemen, and the IEA warned that the world's energy security depends on an outcome that isn't happening. The DRC Ebola outbreak has killed 967 people and infected over 2,400. Healthcare workers are on strike, patients are fleeing facilities to find food, and the WHO says the outbreak is ahead of the response. And the international health system that is supposed to prevent this from becoming something larger is operating with reduced resources in exactly the conditions that have produced every major Ebola crisis in living memory. And FIFA is investigating what happened in a tunnel after the World Cup final. While the questions that matter more, about calls to presidents, about VAR inconsistencies, about a governing body's president and a competing team, remain without formal inquiry. The three stories share a structure. In each case, an institutional response is happening. Diplomats are talking. The WHO is scaling up. FIFA is investigating. In each case, that institutional response is addressing something other than the most significant dimension of the actual problem. The talks are happening while the bombing is too. The WHO is scaling up into a context of unpaid healthcare workers and patients fleeing for food. FIFA is investigating a corridor while leaving unexamined the decisions of its own leadership. That gap between the institutional response and the actual problem is not coincidence. It is what institutions do when they need to appear to be responding without having to confront the parts of the problem that implicate themselves.